Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kevin Hart, the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Manitoba. He's held many portfolios, including water, housing, child welfare, and MMIWG. Hart just announced he will not be seeking a third term as Regional Chief for Manitoba. Chief Hart, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Good morning, Dennis. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. You just recently announced you do not plan to seek a third term as the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Manitoba. What was behind that decision?
Well, for me, I've in the last couple terms, I feel that the work that we were able to accomplish speaks for itself. We've seen it in successive budgets. I remember in 2015 when I was elected, when we talked about portfolios and such with the National Chief, he asked me some of the interests that I have, and naturally being from Manitoba, we're one of the worst regions when it comes to needs for housing, water, infrastructure investments. And First Nations across this country never seen any investments for decades because of the 10 years under the Conservative government before that. And I took it upon myself. I was young, newly elected. I had energy, and I indicated to the National Chief that I indeed wanted to take on the task of housing and infrastructure for a portfolio. We started out at zero for a budget at the Assembly, and to this today now in 2021, the housing infrastructure budget at the Assembly of First Nations now operates 42% of that total budget. Just
as we're talking about you stepping aside, we're going to talk more about your portfolios, but just in the last few days, there have been some whispers in the wind, I guess you could say, that you might be planning a run for National Chief this summer. Any truth to that?
I have thought about it. I've talked with family, however, I haven't made any decisions on that. Like many things, I've heard over the years that with the work I've done, not only as a First Nation leader, but my service in the public sector as well, I feel that it's time to move on, to give new energy. Whoever the new regional chief in here is in Manitoba that's elected, whether he or she takes on the responsibilities, yes. But for myself, I have a number of opportunities that I'm exploring aside from thinking about running for National Chief. I know that my name has been put up possibly for Senate appointment. I haven't thought about it, but there's a possibility of running as a member of Parliament. And then, of course, for myself, as you know, Dennis, I lost my house last year. And in politics, you just simply, you can't make money in politics. And if I was to enter the private sector or even the public sector, I'm sure that my wealth of experience and background knowledge in both negotiating resource development deals with the Wasquatam projects for my home community of Nishnawasi Cree Nation, my service here to the province of Manitoba, working in the Manitoba legislature under a great man, the Honorable Eric Robinson, as well as, I've been mentored along the way. I've had and been blessed to work with great people like Senator Murray Sinclair, as well as other great leaders there, both at the grassroots level, at the regional level, provincially, as well as internationally.
Of course, also not seeking a third term is the current National Chief, Perry Bellegarde. What do you see as his legacy as he steps aside from the AFN?
Well, if we look at the legacy of our current National Chief, Perry Bellegarde, we could see that indeed We have brought a total of in excess of $39 billion to the table for First Nations. This past year, for example, we've influenced $18 billion in the federal budget. It's unprecedented, the investment that's coming forward for First Nations in such aspects, and for example, early learning. You know, there's $2.5 billion in new money there. Emergency management, there's $1.4 billion of new monies there. When we look at the implementation of C-92, there's $1 billion of new monies there available for that implementation, as well as, I believe, an additional $73.2 million that's available for First Nations to exercise their jurisdiction as well as their sovereignty when it comes to child welfare, as well as when it comes to the jurisdiction sovereignty over our children and their care.
As we mentioned in the intro, you've held some of the biggest portfolios, MMIWG, water, housing, child welfare, and you feel there's been some major progress on those fronts. Let's start with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, as we just had the National Day of Awareness. The inquiry issued its final report 2 years ago almost now, but we've heard little when it comes to the promised action plan. I'd heard that it might be coming next month. What can you tell us?
What we're hearing is that there's going to be an action plan over the next 5 years from the federal government. Of course, there's a lot of gray areas that need to be ironed out. For myself, as the past portfolio holder for the Women's Council, MMIWG, and the National Inquiry, you know, my heart and my time as a helper is for the families, for all the missing sisters out there. You know, I think of those families. I think of the time when the National Chief gave me the portfolio, and immediately, because I grew up in the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, I went out to Clearwater Lake and offered some tobacco at the pump house, where of course our late sister Helen Betty Osborne was life was taken away. And you know, I asked for direction, and I prayed to her, and I asked her to ensure that I did justice with this portfolio for the many, many families across this country. And you know, when we had the inquiries across the country, myself as a portfolio holder, I ensured that I attended as many as possible from the very first day till the last day, that I sat with families, that I listened to families, that I supported families, but most importantly that, you know, I prayed and I stood with them and I supported them. And I think that when I look back at it now, you know, I think of that work and the many beautiful people out there that I was able to meet due to unfortunate circumstances and tragic circumstances sometimes. I think of the downtown marches in Vancouver that I attended. I think of the march in Edmonton for our sister there, as well as the different gatherings that we had for loved ones across this country, the march in Thunder Bay, you know, for the missing boys that was occurring there, as well as the missing sisters there. So, you know, at the end of the day, it's I was just a servant to our brothers and sisters out there, and trying to give a voice to silenced and forgotten voices, I guess you can say.
Regional Chief, we do hope that those, you know, those recommendations, that testimony, those stories are certainly honored. We do have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with AFN Regional Chief for Manitoba, Kevin Hart. Stick around. to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the Regional Chief of the AFN for Manitoba, Kevin Hart. And Chief Hart, talking about some of the portfolios you had, one of them, of course, was water. And when it comes to clean water on First Nations, there was another setback reported this week as well. Liberals had pledged to end long-term drinking water advisories by 2021. They're now saying that might be 2026. What are your thoughts? There have been 106 advisories lifted. What are your thoughts on where things are at when it comes to water on First Nations?
Well, with this past year's budget, we've seen $6 billion directed towards infrastructure. So we know that the Canadian government is able to accommodate infrastructure investments when it comes to First Nation needs. If you look back at the Walkerton inquiry, back then during that time, the provincial government and the federal government, they were able in a couple of years, I believe, to repair not only the Walkerton infrastructure, but as well as the municipalities that were surrounding it, where they found inadequate infrastructure needs when it comes to clean drinking water. So we show that provincial and federal governments can get together to address the chronic underlying issue of safe drinking water in First Nations.
Another issue portfolio that you held was child welfare, and the long call to hand over child welfare to Indigenous people has also somewhat been answered through Bill C-92, which is now the law of the land. Yet we don't see, at least here in Manitoba, a noticeable decrease in the number of children in care. What more needs to be done there?
What we're seeing right now is that because of the pandemic situation, since January of this year, we've only seen one First Nation come forward with their laws. We understand that there's a number of First Nations as well as tribal councils in the Manitoba region that are currently in development of their law under C-92 or without using the provisions of C-92, which I fully support. Each and every First Nation they're very unique, because I was just attending a FPTI meeting yesterday, and we talked about C-92 and its implementation. And I indicated to the provinces and territories that we're not asking for delegated authority because our rights are already inherent when it comes to the jurisdiction of our children. It's also the same thing when we talk about, for example, when we're talking about child welfare. We're currently have a 9th order of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders that are before the courts, and that Canada is still not complying even after a 9th order. And you remember, Dennis, that shortly after I was elected, the tribunal order came down where it indicated the federal government does indeed underfund First Nation child and family services.
Certainly a long-standing issue. I'd like to move to the AFN itself, and there's been some infighting in recent months, starting with a resolution calling for an investigative review of the AFN to end sexual orientation and gender-based discrimination. It didn't receive unanimous support. What are your thoughts on that investigation?
Right now, for myself as an executive member, I can't make no comment because I am indeed, as one of the executive members, fully cooperating with the investigation at hand. All of us as executive members are complying with that, including myself, where I handed over all the electronic equipment and documents that I have in my possession that were distributed by the Assembly of First Nations. It's in terms of what was talked about in terms of our data breach. I know that also that there is a harassment investigation that's ongoing right now. Again, I won't make no comments to that because I have not seen the report yet. Once I do see the report, of course, I'm going to have to look it over. I'm going to have to talk with leadership as well as my own knowledge keepers before we meet as an executive for myself to provide my comments.
There's also been conflict of interest concerns raised, the call for an independent audit. The AFN's budget in the last 5 years or so has gone from about $2.4 million to $46 million in 2020. Should there be an independent financial review at the AFN?
I think right now with our management committee, we have 5 regional chiefs. I'm not one of them that are part of that management committee that oversee all the contracts and such that are vetted. When contracts over $50,000 need to be approved, they do come to us at the executive level for approval. With that, we do get the information as well as the briefing note that goes with that. My understanding is that the Assembly of First Nations has unqualified audits, and that for myself, I trust my colleagues, the management team, as well as the team that we have at the Assembly of First Nations, including the finance team and our CEO. So if the direction comes from the chiefs that we have to have an audit, then I take my direction from the chiefs. But like I said, Dennis, May 31st is going to be my last day, and then I'm taking holidays. So yeah. Our next regional chief and the next national chief, that's going to be a task for them to undertake with the new leadership.
As someone who is stepping aside, the election's obvious. We've got an open seat for the national chief too. But what do you make of some of this rather public infighting that's going on within the organization?
I haven't seen any public infighting for myself at the organization. I know that for us as executive members, we're all professional. We've been honorable. We've all signed oaths. We all part of a code of conduct and such. And to that degree and extent, at this point, like I said, there's 2 ongoing investigations with the data breach as well as the harassment claim. I can't make any comments on those because we haven't heard from either reports or either final reports. I know that there is an independent report being conducted right now on the harassment claim, and that also on the data breach that there's an ongoing investigation right now that for myself as an executive member I'm fully participating in.
Regional Chief, more to talk about here, but we do have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with AFN Regional Chief for Manitoba, Kevin Hart. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the AFN Regional Chief for Manitoba, Kevin Hart. Regional Chief Hart, the AFN has been long criticized as being out of touch with the grassroots and people at the community level. Is that something you would agree with 6 years after serving?
I truly believe in the grassroots movement because before I was elected as regional chief, I was part of that grassroots movement. Mm-hmm. I've seen that grassroots movement since I was a small child, and I've seen the various movements here and the fights that we've had. For example, education, that long-standing battle of education and the 2% cap. I remember the demonstrations outside the building at 275 Portage 20 years ago. I remember the various demonstrations of grassroots people outside the Manitoba legislature, at the field across from the Manitoba legislature. We've been on various walks. There's been various sacred runs across this country and such. So I think that for myself, I've been very respectful to the grassroots movement. When I hear about the grassroots movement, when they're out there fighting for clean water, when they're fighting for the rights of our people, I fully support them because I was there as one of those people trying to fight for the very same things. After time,
go ahead.
I was elected as the regional chief. So,
Regional Chief, we're down to our last...
Go ahead, Dennis. I said after time I was elected the regional chief.
Sorry, we got the little delay there, but down to our last 2 minutes. But what would you say to those who believe the AFN is no longer relevant as we head into an AFN election here?
For someone to say that the AFN is not relevant, I would tell you to look at the work that I was able to accomplish with our chiefs committees, with our technicians, with the mandate that we received from chiefs across this country, as well as myself, indeed, listening to the grassroots movement, watching what transpired across this country. You know, my hearts go out to everybody right now that have been affected during this pandemic. My hearts go out to, you know, all those ones that are homeless during this pandemic. You know, this pandemic has reared its ugly head, and we see a number of our First Nations people that have fallen through the cracks when it comes to services and that. So that shows that there's more work that needs to be done. For myself, as the portfolio holder under emergency measures, I have been the co-chair of the COVID-19 task force at the Assembly, and we have been able to fight for every investment to protect what I think is our most precious resource, you know, our knowledge keepers, our women and our children, especially during this pandemic, to get the necessary investments for PPE, to get the necessary investments like we talked about, clean drinking water. This pandemic has shown that for us to have clean drinking water in our First Nations, we need to continue to have that fight and advocacy. So for organizations such as the Assembly of First Nations, it's much needed that I see. At the end of the day, do we want to see organizations like the Assembly of First Nations sunset? Of course we do, because true sovereignty and jurisdiction is that nation-to-nation relationship between the government and each individual First Nation, including getting the necessary resources and investments to each individual First Nation across this country. So a lot of people say, is that a dream? Is that a vision? Yes, it is. We're going to have new young leadership, invigorated with new fresh ideas that are going to look outside the box, that are going to be able to adapt, because right now, you know, what we've done as First Nations people is that we've been able to survive, we've been able to thrive, but most importantly, you know, our people are looking at being able to live now. And I think that's something that's not too far off for us in the distant future when we talk about the sovereignty and the jurisdiction, when we talk about reconciliation, as well as when we talk about the hard work that leadership and grassroots people across this country, because at the end of the day, this pandemic has shown that no matter what, whether I'm a regional chief or whether I'm the cousin next door living at the house, this pandemic has shown that we're all together as one, as human beings, and that we're just trying to protect and take care of one another.
Regional Chief, we'll have to leave it there, but good words, and we appreciate you taking some time for us this week, appreciate your service, and looking forward to what's next for you.
All right, you take care, Dennis, and be safe, okay?
You too. That is all the time we have for this week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you back here on Face to Face in 1 week's time.